Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we're going to do some more vigorous processing to this found sound that we've recorded here in this audio track. So first I'm going to make a new MIDI track, and instead of going for something typical such as this dull thumps, obviously we could quite easily make that into a kick drum, but what we're going to do instead is we're going to push ourselves a little bit further and actually use sounds that we wouldn't use for things like kicks or percussion or ambient. So we'll start off with making a kick drum, and what we'll do is we'll use something a little bit unorthodox and we'll go with some ambience, and we're going to really morph and process this sound and get it into a nice sounding kick drum. So while we're listening back to this sample, I'm going to load up some metering tools. So here we have a free plugin called Voxengo Span, which is a really good spectrum analyzer which I've put into low frequency spectrum mode, and then we've also got this oscilloscope here as well from Smexoscope, and both of these are free plugins, so definitely check them out. So I'm pretty happy with the ambient Market Street sound that I've got here. So if I just drag this into the MIDI track and drop it after the scale device, then you can see it populates into a simpler device. So we can mute out our bunch of samples and we can now play this sample. So you can see we can obviously change the modes. I'm going to change this to a sampler because it gives us a little bit more control. Firstly, we're going to want to find a better sample start point, so we can just drag this arrow across, or we can use the dialog box. And then once we've found a good area, we can zoom in and we can be a bit more precise, and we can also make sure we're either on or not on a zero crossing point. And if we're on a zero crossing, it's going to be a bit smoother, and if we're not on one, then it's going to give us a little bit of a click, which we're probably going to want in this case because we're doing a transient style sort of kick sound. If I push up this fader, you can see we're not quite on, so I'll leave that as it is. That's absolutely fine. And if we look at the spectrum analyzer, we can see we've got a peak at around 1.3, 1.4k there. So what we're going to do is use a bit of logic and just drag in a kick drum, have a look at the kick drum sample on the spectrum analyzer, and get a better idea of maybe what the next step is into getting a sound that sounds like a good kick drum. So I'll just go for a good old 909 kick and I'll pull that in, and then that means I can compare that to the one that I'm working on, which I can just play in using the computer keyboard, so I can just hit notes as and when I need to hear how the sound's changing. So looking on the spectrum analyzer, we've got around 50 hertz on that decent 909 kick drum, so I'm just going to pull Span back across onto our original track, and all we have to do now is pitch this down until we're roughly at around 50 hertz. So we can see that making its way down, and now we've got into a bit of a problem because we've gone down 4 octaves. We're down at 48 semitones, and we still aren't where we need to be. We're at about 80 or 90 hertz, so I'm going to use a frequency shifter to get us the rest of the way using the fine control on the frequency shifter. If I just place this in the chain, then what we're doing is just solving one problem at a time, making our way through the chain, and we can get this down to where it needs to be. So when you add new plugins into the chain to solve problems, make sure you put them in the right place. So if I pick up this frequency shifter and move it on the other side of the oscilloscope and Span, then there's no point having them on there because I can't see how it's affecting the signal. So as you add things, make sure it goes in front of your metering plugins. So let's just pull this down now and try and get into the right range. So we're talking somewhere around 45 up to around maybe 57, 60 hertz. So that's anywhere from F1 up to about B1. If you need to fine tune this, then you can use the command function when you're adjusting the fine control, and you can just move in tiny increments and really get the frequency spot on. So now we're in the right ballpark. We need to think about maybe boosting this signal a little bit as it's looking a little bit on the quiet side. So for this, I'm just going to use a bog standard utility device. So we can just throw this on and add a few decibels of gain. There's loads of ways we could do this. We could just do it from the sampler, but in this case, I'm going to do it from the utility device. So we've got a plug-in for each sort of thing that we're doing. Now that we've done that, if you listen to that, it's actually in stereo at the moment. And if you look at the channel fader, you can see we've got more level on the left, because remember, this is a stereo recording. So what we can do is listen to the different sides, or we could also just reduce this to mono. And in this case, I think the left side is a little bit more punchy, so I'm going to go with that. And this now means that we've got no stereo madness going on with our kick. It's mono, it's nice and clear, and it's punchy, and that's how most kicks should be. So keep it mono for your kicks. Next up, I'm going to add some saturation, and this is for two reasons. Firstly, because I want to add a little bit more gain, and secondly, because I want to warm up the signal, and as the name suggests, I want to saturate it. So that's going to push up the level, but it's not going to increase the peak volume or the peak level. So we're just pushing up the drive, and to compensate for pushing up the drive, we reduce the output. And this just stops us going out too hot or clipping our output on our master. And then we can just mess around with the different settings, see if we've got a different type of clipping mode or saturation mode. So soft sine sounds quite nice, but I might try out some different ones. Maybe we'll go for analog clip. And we can see now in the oscilloscope we've got quite a nice healthy signal going on. If we look at the spectrum analyzer, we can see we have a bit of a build up below 50 Hz that we don't really need. It's just going to muddy up the mix at this point. So we can add a sub back in later if we want, but we need to clean this up. So I'm just going to use a 4-pole EQ, and we're going to set that to 50 Hz because we know our fundamental is at 55 Hz, and that's just cleaned that up nicely. You can see if I mute that or bypass it, you can see all of this come back in, and if I turn it back on, it just cuts that away. So now we need to think about refining the sound a little bit more, so we can go back to the actual sampler device and we can maybe think about tightening up or loosening decays, sustain and release our ADSR envelope. And if we have a look in the oscilloscope, we can see the sound is still looking a bit flat, not in terms of amplitude but in terms of frequency. So we can see it's all pretty much just one tone. If we have a look at this kick drum, then we can see we have, even when this is warped, you can see we have this sort of sustained part of the kick. This is going to be the subby part, and this part is the sharp downward pitch. It's like the transient of the sound. So these waves are more tight together, which is a higher frequency, and these waves are further apart, which is going to give us the lower frequency. So let's listen, and you can hear there you have got the hit at the start, and then you've got the subby decay. So we're now going to emulate that on our sound using the pitch envelope. Let's go to the pitch os tab, and we turn the amount up, and straight away you can hear that starting to get in the right area. So we'll keep that about 24. And then we also have the decay, which is how long it takes to reach this pitch. So it's going from 24 semitones all the way down back to 0, and it's going to do that in 317 milliseconds. So you can see we get different flavors of kick drum by doing that. So what I'm going to do is going to go Command and G, and I'm going to macro map this so we have a bit more control over how our kick sounds. So let's quickly rename these macros and keep the housekeeping nice and tidy. We'll go for pitch envelope, and we'll go for pitch decay. And then if we press the map button, then what we can do is we can map these parameters within certain limitations. So I know that about 0 semitones to 36 sounded quite good, and around 200 milliseconds to 600 milliseconds sounds quite good. So now whatever we do, if we stay within those limits, then it should sound pretty good. So we can push this up. Oh, sorry, I wanted that to be 12 semitones actually. Now we can push that up to the highest setting, and we've got quite a exaggerated bouncy kick drum. And then we can put it down to more subtle settings and have a harder, more duller kick drum. So there's plenty of combinations of settings to mess around with here, but I think I'll go with something fairly neutral, about 24 semitones and 500 milliseconds. And we can adjust that later on if we need to as the sound develops. Something I've noticed is that our kick is ringing out in the tail a little bit too long, or more than I'd like, and it's something that's easier solved with something like a gate or with compression rather than using the ADSR envelope. Another way of doing it is also just to slice the sound when it's in audio as well. But in this case we'll use a gate. So you can hear and you can see straight away there that it's just chopping off the end of that sound, and it's really tightening it up and making it more punchy. So I'm not going to change any of the settings there. Now I'm going to just compress this signal slightly because we've gated it, made it a bit punchier and a little bit tighter, but I just want to bring up the RMS slightly and just sort of add to the punchiness. So I'm just going to go for some fairly generic settings here, around 10 milliseconds on the attack. Leave the ratio at 4:1. I'm just going to pull down on the threshold till it sounds about right to my ear. And also I'm going to leave the makeup gain on in this case, just so I don't have to set it manually, as it does a fairly good job of it itself. Okay, so now what we need to do is think about maybe splitting this signal up into frequency bands so we can affect the different frequency bands separately and get a little bit more control over what we're doing, because we have got a bit of a strange little click that I can hear at the very top of the frequency spectrum, which is ringing out a bit too much. So the best way to do this is to use Multiband Dynamics, in my opinion, we go to the chain selector, duplicate this 3 times, and we'll rename them high, mid, and low. So this is now a parallel chain. So all we do is go into each one of these chains and we solo the respective band for that chain. And this doesn't actually affect the signal at the moment. It's just allowing us to split the signal into 3. So if I turn it off and turn it on, there's no difference whatsoever yet. So now we can go in and we can solo each one of these chains, and we can actually hear what they sound like split by the frequency bands set in the Multiband Dynamics. So if we listen to this high, we can hear the problem I was on about. We've got this laser sort of style sound, which is just ringing out way too long. So we can address all of these problems one by one. So keeping an eye on our gain staging, if we look at the output meter here, it's starting to get a little bit hot. So what I'm going to do is just put all of these chain levels down by maybe about -5 decibels. And then once we've done that, we can dive in to the high band first and have a listen to it, see what we need to do. So I know that we're going to need to gate it straight away to try and get rid of some of that ring. And at the moment, we're not hearing any sound because it's not passing through the gate. So I'm just going to get rid of the return and pull the threshold down until it's just touching the very top of that peak. So we see we can get the sound coming back through now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close up the gate. So it's going to really tighten up on the sound. So we'll take the hold off and I'm going to maybe pull in the release as well and pull the floor right down. And this means that we're only going to get a little 5 millisecond burst and then it's going to go straight down to silence. So it's gone from this, a laser type sound, to just a nice little click. And we could harden up that click a bit more if we want, which make it a little bit fuller or warmer just by adding a saturator. And we'll just scroll through the presets. So I quite like that. We'll leave that as it is. So that's our high band taken care of, and we can now move on to the mid band. So we'll have a listen to that. So we can see on the oscilloscope it's got quite a pronounced attack, and we can see in the spectrum analyzer whereabouts we've got in the frequency spectrum. So it's quite a nice mid-range punchy sound. We're just going to compress this slightly to accentuate that punchiness. So as for the settings on this compressor, I'm going to go for very similar settings to what I used earlier. So go for a 10 millisecond attack, a 50 millisecond release, and we'll turn the makeup gain on and just dial in the threshold until it has the effect that we're after. So that's a little bit further now, just reducing that transient ever so slightly, just to bring up the RMS level. And now as for the low band, I don't think we need to do much here, apart from maybe just push the volume up slightly. So maybe we'll go for -3. Just sounds a little bit more subby, a little bit lower to me, which is what I'm after, a bit of power and weight. And it means I don't have to add in any extra frequencies either. So I'll leave that as it is. We're just going to call this the splitter rack, and I can tuck that away. And now it's just a case of some creative effects and just pulling the sounds back together again, as we did split them into 3 different frequency bands. So the overdrive, I could obviously rack this up with the actual instrument, but I'm just going to throw it on the end here, and it's just going to give us a bit more variation of different tones, or maybe different sort of textures or timbres that we might want within the sound. So we can get the sound we want, and then once we've got a rough idea of the sound, we can dial back that drive, and then we can also pull back the dry wet and the dynamics as well until we've got it so it's real subtle, or we could even use this in parallel. But in this case, I'm just going to keep it at a really, really low level. So we'll maybe go for about 20%. So let's just bypass that. So I'm happy with how that sounds, so we can move on to the next plugin. And it's not always necessary, but I like to add an EQ at this point, and we can just clean up the general sound so far, usually pull out a bit of the low mids and boost any frequencies we might want. In this case, I'm just going to go for a bit of a low mid cut, because I can hear there's a bit of a frequency that's sticking out a little bit to my ear, and that could cause us some problems a little bit later on when we're going to go for the final compression and gentle limiting. So this is where I'm hearing the problem, around where the pressure point is. It's just a little bit too much for me. So I don't know why it's done that. Let's pull that up. It's actually a bit higher than the pressure point. We're at about 230 hertz, which is where the low mid sort of mud usually is, around 200, 300 hertz. I'm just going to pull that out we'll go for about 5 decibels. We've also got a Q factor here of 1.4. It's quite a big bandwidth. It's about an octave. In this case, it seems to be working, but in other cases I'd tighten that up considerably. So now we can move on to the compression. I'm going to go for the glue compressor. This might actually be better with a normal compressor, as it might be a bit faster with the look ahead, but I'll use this for now. So we can just set the attack as fast as it will go, and we just want this to kiss the very top of our transient, so we're going to have a nice hard ratio of 10:1, and then we just literally want to see the tiniest amount of movement in the meters here. Some of the eagle-eyed of you have noticed that we've got quite a large peak there at the front of our transient, and that's probably caused from the glue compressor because it's not quite fast enough. So maybe we could have done with using a standard compressor, but for now we'll save that as it is, and I'm gonna duplicate this compressor because this is our, this was supposed to be our peak catcher, but in fact it's given us a peak. But we're going to use another one, and this one is going to be our generic sort of punch and shaping compressor. So once again, we'll just go for some fairly standard settings. All I'm trying to do here is just get the final tone right and shape the ADSR envelope exactly how I want it. Then what we can do is we can add a limiter, and this is going to help us solve that problem that we tried to solve earlier with the peak catcher, but we just made it worse. So what I'm going to do is push the gain up into the ceiling of the limiter, and that's just going to chop off the top of this sound, or it's going to limit it, which is basically going to put it down with compression. So we've got about between 4 and 5 decibels of gain reduction happening here, and sometimes this can add unwanted distortion, but in this case I think it sounds fine, and that's just going to give us a nice hard transient on the front of our kick drum. So I've gone a little bit OTT with effects here. If you can help it, only use effects methodically to solve a problem in a logical way, but if I group these together, I just want to show you the difference now. So this is with the effects, and then without the effects, and then without the pitch envelope, and then without the transposition. So we've literally gone from a high-pitched scream to a low sound, to a low-pitched sound, to a full-blown kick drum. So you can literally turn anything you want into anything if you know what you're doing and you approach it in a logical manner, working from one plugin to the next, trying to get you bit by bit in the right ballpark, using references as well. And the good thing about doing this with found sound is not only is it experimental and gets the creative juices flowing, but also these sounds are completely unique to you. So the timbre and the intricacies of the sound can eventually become part of your signature sound.